The first thing I noticed was the orchid. I had been gone for 11 months. An overseas posting. I worked in international development, and this particular assignment had taken it to a country where reliable internet was a luxury. Time zones made phone calls difficult, and the rhythm of daily life was so consuming that the distance between me and home had gradually stopped feeling urgent. I had a house, I had a car. I had a best friend named Sarah who had offered, when I left, to check on things occasionally. Water the plant on the windowsill, forward any mail that looked important, be a presence. I came home on a Tuesday afternoon in March. The orchid on the windowsill was not mine. Mine had been white, fragile and slightly unhappy, the way orchids tend to be when they are not quite in the right light. The orchid on the windowsill was pink, full and healthy, and sitting in a pot I did not recognize, positioned in the exact spot where my white one had been. I stood in the doorway of my own house with my suitcase, and I looked at that orchid for a long time. Then I looked at the rest of the room. The furniture was the same. The layout was the same. But there were small things everywhere. A throw blanket folded over the arm of the sofa that I had never owned. A set of candles on the coffee table arranged in a way I would never have arranged them. A photograph on the bookshelf that I recognized only after a moment as being of Sarah and my boyfriend Daniel at what appeared to be a restaurant I had recommended to both of them separately and never been to together. I set my suitcase down. I walked through every room. And by the time I reached the bedroom, where the sheets were changed and the dresser had been reorganized, and there was a second toothbrush in the bathroom holder, I understood with absolute quiet clarity what 11 months of distance had made possible. I picked up my phone. I called Sarah. She answered on the second ring, warm and immediate, the voice of a woman who did not know she had been seen yet. She said, "You are back early." I said, "I am. The house looks great." She said, "I just wanted to make sure it was taken care of." I said, "I can tell. Thank you." I hung up. I sat on the edge of the bed in a room that smelled faintly of someone else's perfume, and I thought, I need to understand the full shape of this before I say another word. My name is Nadia, and what happened in the 4 months after I came home, what I found, what I documented, and what I eventually built, is a story about the particular kind of person who looks at your life and decides they would like it more than you do. And what happens when you let them believe, for just a little while longer, that they have already gotten away with it. Let me tell you about Sarah first, because the worst betrayals are always the ones that start with the most genuine thing. Sarah and I had been friends since we were 19 years old. We met in university, the first week of the first year. At an orientation event we both found unbearable and left early to find coffee. We talked for 3 hours in a cafe around the corner, and by the end of it we understood, with the particular certainty that is only available to 19-year-olds, that we had found the kind of friendship that was going to matter. And it did matter. For a very long time it mattered enormously. Sarah was the person who drove 4 hours to collect me when a relationship ended badly in my mid-20s. She was the person who proofread every important document I ever wrote, who knew every version of my complicated feelings about my family, who had been present at every significant moment of my adult life in one form or another. She was my emergency contact. She had a key to my house not because I had given it to her recently, but because I had given it to her years ago, and it had never occurred to me to ask for it back. That is the thing about long friendships. The infrastructure of them accumulates over time. The shared history, the access, the knowledge. It builds up so gradually and so naturally that, at some point, you stop noticing what you have extended and what you have left open. Sarah had noticed. I need to be precise about the timeline, because the timeline matters. I left for my overseas posting in April. Before I left, Sarah and I had dinner. She said she would check on the house. I said that was generous, and I appreciated it. We hugged and I got into the cab, and that was the last time I saw her as the person I thought she was. What I did not know at that point, Sarah had been seeing Daniel for 6 weeks. Daniel was my boyfriend of 2 years. We were not engaged, not living together. I had the house. He had his own apartment across the city. But we were, as far as I had understood it, committed. When I left, we agreed to maintain the relationship across the distance. Video calls, messages, the reasonable architecture of two people who expected to continue. Sarah had been sleeping with Daniel for 6 weeks before I boarded that plane. I did not know this when I left. I learned it 11 months later, in pieces, over the 4 months after I came home. What I want to tell you about the 11 months I was away is not the betrayal. I was not there to experience the betrayal as it was happening. What I want to tell you is what I came back to. By the time I returned, Sarah had been living in my house for 7 months. Not occasionally, not as a caretaker. She had moved the majority of her belongings in gradually, replaced things that were mine with things that were hers, and had constructed, piece by piece, a version of my home that felt occupied by someone else. The white orchid replaced with the pink one, my sheets replaced with hers, my kitchen reorganized to her preferences, my spare room, which I used as a study, cleared out and refurnished as a dressing room. She had been driving my car. My insurance documents still listed me as the primary driver, but the mileage told a different story. Several thousand kilometers more than the car should have accumulated from occasional checks. She had been attending, as my representative, social events I would have attended. Dinners with friends, a birthday party for someone I had known for a decade, a work function of Daniel's where she had been introduced. I learned later. Not as Sarah, my friend, but simply as present in a way that allowed people to draw their own conclusions about who she was in his life. And Daniel had allowed it. That was the piece that took me the longest to fully absorb. Not Sarah's behavior, which I came to understand over time as the behavior of someone who had wanted my life for years and had finally found the opening. But Daniel who had called me every Sunday for 11 months and asked about my work and told me about his week and said consistently that he missed me and was looking forward to my return. Daniel, who had been sharing my house and my bed with my best friend for most of those 11 months and had said nothing. I want to tell you about the 4 months after I came home. But first, I need to tell you about the person who was waiting for me. Her name was Priya. She had been part of our friend group for 5 years. Not the inner circle that Sarah and I had formed, but a consistent presence. The kind of person who is always slightly on the edge of the main event, observing more than participating. The one in the group photo who is almost out of frame. Priya had sent me a message 3 months before I came home. A short one, careful and oblique, that said only, "When you are back, I would like to talk to you about something. Not urgent, but I wanted you to know I am here." I had not thought much of it at the time. I had replied and said I would reach out when I was settled. And then I came home and stood in my bedroom and found the second toothbrush, and I thought about Priya's message, and I understood, with the instinct that comes from years of working in environments where subtext carries as much weight as text, that she had been waiting. I called her the morning after I came home. She answered immediately. She said, "I was wondering when you would call." She said, "How much do you want to know?" I said, "It's all of it." She said, "Then I am going to need a few hours." What Priya told me over the following days was a careful, precise, and thoroughly documented account of 11 months. She had been watching because she had understood from early on that what Sarah was doing was not temporary. She had seen it escalate from key-holding to caretaking to something that did not have a polite name. She had said something to Sarah once, in the early months. A careful, diplomatic thing about boundaries and the difference between caring for a friend's home and replacing a friend. Sarah had received this with warmth and a deflection so practiced that Priya had understood immediately that the conversation had been anticipated and pre-managed. After that, Priya had started keeping notes. I want to tell you something about Priya, because she deserves more than a supporting role in this story. Priya was not someone who had ever occupied the center of our social world. She was, by temperament and by choice, someone who sat slightly to the side of things, present, observant, and consistently underestimated by the kind of people who equate visibility with importance. Sarah, who had always been at the center, had never paid much attention to Priya. I think this was a significant mistake. What Priya had, and what Sarah had never bothered to notice, was the quality that I have come to think of as the most undervalued kind of intelligence. She remembered everything. Not in the obsessive way, not in the way of someone who is cataloging for a purpose, just in the ordinary way of a person who is genuinely paying attention when other people have stopped. She remembered the evening, 4 months after I left, when Sarah had arrived at a group dinner and mentioned offhandedly that she had been dealing with a plumbing issue at the flat, as if the house were hers, as if the word were natural. She remembered the birthday party where Daniel had introduced Sarah to someone he had not seen in years, and the specific word he had used, not friend, not colleague, just a gesture and a first name and the assumption of context that creates its own category. She remembered a Sunday afternoon in late autumn when she had driven past my house and seen lights on in the study, the room I had always used for work. The room that, when she drove past 3 weeks later, had its curtains rearranged in a way that suggested the furniture had changed. None of these things were individually alarming. Each one had an explanation that was technically plausible. But Priya had been watching long enough to understand that individually plausible and collectively true are not the same thing. After that, Priya had started keeping notes, not for any specific purpose at first, just because she was the kind of person who noticed things and had learned, somewhere in her life, that noticing without recording was a way of letting things be rewritten later. She had notes on dates, on things she had observed, on conversations she had been party to that had struck her as wrong in ways she could not always name immediately, on the dinner where Daniel had introduced Sarah in a way that was technically accurate and completely misleading, on the birthday party where Sarah had arrived alone and been treated by the hosts, who did not know the full situation, as a guest with standing she had not earned. She had saved messages, screenshots of a group chat where Sarah had mentioned me in ways that were individually unremarkable and collectively a portrait of someone positioning herself as my replacement rather than my friend. She handed me everything she had in a folder she had already prepared. It was a plain manila folder, unremarkable, the kind you buy in a pack of 10 from any office supply store. She had labeled it in small, careful handwriting with nothing but a date, the date I had left for the posting. I held it and I did not open it immediately. I want to try to describe what that moment felt like, because I do not think I have the right words for it even now. I had been home for 3 days. I had walked through every room of my occupied house and said nothing. I had called Sarah and thanked her and hung up and sat on the edge of the bed. I had operated for 72 hours on the combined weight of what I had found and the decision I had made not to act on it yet. And now I was holding a folder that a woman I had underestimated for years had spent 11 months building for me, that she had dated from the day I left, that she had carried to this meeting in a bag over her shoulder, as if it were an ordinary object, and not, as I understood it to be, the most careful act of friendship I had ever been on the receiving end of. I held that folder, and I felt for the first time since I had come home that I was not alone in what I was carrying. I held that folder, and I thought about Priya, who had spent 11 months on the outside of something she could not stop, writing things down, because she had understood that one day someone would need to know. I said, "Why did you wait?" She said, "Because telling you from 10,000 kilometers away, with nothing I could do to help you, would have given you the pain without any of the power. I wanted you to have both." That is the truest thing anyone said to me during the 4 months that followed. I spent the first month home saying nothing. I know that is difficult to understand. I had come home to find my life occupied. I had called Sarah from my reorganized bedroom and thanked her for taking care of the house. I had called Daniel that same evening and listened to him tell me how happy he was that I was back. And then I had sat with what I knew, and I had decided, as deliberately as I have ever decided anything, that I was not ready to act. I want to be honest about what that first month cost. There is a version of strength that looks like not feeling things. That is not what I had. I felt things constantly and quite intensely throughout that first month. I felt the specific humiliation of coming home to find that the life I had left was now inhabited by someone else. I felt the grief of the friendship which had been real, and which the discovery of its betrayal did not make retroactively false. Those 18 years had happened, and the person I had trusted had been, at least partially, the person I had believed her to be until she was not. I felt the particular anger that comes from realizing that someone has been performing care for you while systematically dismantling what the care was supposed to protect. And I felt the uncomfortable awareness that I had given Sarah the means to do this. The key, the trust, the 11 months of absence. Not culpably, I had done nothing wrong. But the infrastructure of a long friendship includes vulnerabilities that you do not think about when the friendship is good, and I had not thought about them. All of this I felt, and none of it I showed, and holding those two things simultaneously for a month was the most demanding thing I had done since the posting. But I had learned, during 11 months in a country where showing the wrong thing at the wrong time had real consequences, that the most useful emotion is not the one you feel, but the one you choose to display. I had felt everything. I had chosen to display curiosity, warmth, and the relaxed demeanor of a woman who had come home and found things more or less in order. Sarah had believed it completely. That told me what I needed to know about how carefully she was watching. Here is what I understood from the first night. Sarah had constructed something over 11 months. She had not done it carelessly or impulsively. She had done it with the patience and the incrementalism of someone who had been planning it for longer than 11 months, who had simply been waiting for the opportunity that my absence provided. What she had built was a version of my life that had her in my position. My home, my relationship, my social standing, my network of people who had known me for years and who had gradually, through exposure and normalcy, and the human tendency to accept what is presented consistently, begun to accept her presence as unremarkable. If I confronted her immediately, I would be emotional and she would be reasonable. I would be the person who had been away and had come back to find things changed, and she would be the person who had maintained the house and supported Daniel and kept the friendships warm. The story would be rewritten as a misunderstanding, as overreaction, as the inevitable tension between a woman who left and the life that continued without her. I had spent 11 months far away from everything I had built. I was not going to spend the next chapter being the person who came back and broke things. I was going to spend it being the person who came back and understood everything first. So I smiled, and I unpacked. And I started rebuilding very quietly from the inside. The first thing I did was contact my landlord. My house was rented. I owned the lease, not the property, and the lease was in my name alone. The landlord had been receiving rent from my account the entire time I was away, automatic payments that had continued without interruption. What he had not known was that the person living in the house was not me. I explained the situation briefly and professionally. I told him I was back, that I had discovered unauthorized occupation of my property, and that I needed to understand my rights and options under the lease terms before I took any action. He was, to his credit, clear and helpful. The lease was mine. No one else had any legal standing in the property. If I wished to formally notify the unauthorized occupant in writing, I had complete grounds to do so. I thanked him and told him I would be in touch when I was ready. The second thing I did was talk to a solicitor who specialized in personal property and harassment law, not because I planned to take legal action immediately, but because I needed to understand what I was dealing with before I made a single move. What she told me was important. The situation was legally clear. What Sarah had done, occupying my home without consent, using my vehicle without authorization, misrepresenting her relationship to mutual contacts, constituted a documented set of actions that were, depending on how they had been conducted, potentially actionable. The solicitor used a word I had not expected. Sustained, she said. This is not a misunderstanding. The duration and the specificity of it suggests sustained, deliberate conduct. I said yes. She said, do you want to pursue this formally? I said, I want to understand it completely first. She said, then document everything you can from here forward. I already had Priya's folder. Now I started building my own. The third thing I did, and this is the piece that I think people find most unexpected, is that I kept having dinner with Sarah. Twice a month for 4 months, I sat across the table from her, and I had dinner, and I talked about my time abroad, and I listened to her talk about her life, and I said nothing about what I knew. Not because I was performing, but because I was observing. I want to tell you what those 8 dinners were actually like. They were, on the surface, entirely normal. Sarah is a good conversationalist. She always has been. And the particular skill of a good conversationalist is the ability to fill space in a way that feels generous rather than evasive. She asked about the posting. She asked about the readjustment. She asked about small practical things. Was the house comfortable again? Had I sorted the time zone on my phone? Had I been back to the restaurant on the corner? She did not ask about the house in any other sense. She did not refer, even obliquely, to the 7 months she had spent in it. She did not mention Daniel. She did not bring up any of the events she had attended, or the people she had seen. She talked about her own life with the selective detail of someone who has edited a story carefully before telling it. I listened to all of it. I asked questions. I was warm and present and interested in the way that is completely indistinguishable from the outside from not knowing anything. What I was actually doing was watching. I was watching to see if she would mention anything that required me to pretend I did not know it. She never did. She had made a careful calculation about what to present and what to withhold. And she was executing that calculation with the same precision she had applied to everything else. At the 3rd dinner, she mentioned that she had been thinking about finding a new flat. Something closer to the center, she said. A change of scenery. I said, that sounds like a good idea. She looked at me for a moment, then she said, yes, I think it probably is. That was the closest we came, in 8 dinners, to acknowledging what we both knew. And what I observed over those 4 months was this: Sarah did not feel guilty. I want to be specific about this because I think it matters. I had expected, when I came home and maintained the friendship, to see signs of guilt. The small flinches, the overcompensation, the moments of deflection that happen when a person knows they have done something they should not have done and is in the presence of the person they did it to. Sarah had none of these. I want to pause here on something because I think it is the most important thing I observed during those 4 months of dinners. I had come into this with a theory about Sarah. The theory was she did this because she wanted what I had. She had always been slightly in competition with me, or so I had sometimes felt, in the way that close friendships can carry a quiet undercurrent of comparison. The life I had built, the house I had found, the career that took me interesting places, the particular combination of independence and stability that I had assembled slowly and carefully over my 30s, had been, I had always assumed, something she admired in a way that was occasionally adjacent to wanting it for herself. My theory was that what had happened during my absence was the collision of opportunity and long-standing desire. What I observed during those dinners complicated that theory, because Sarah was not looking at my life with longing. She was not watching me with the slightly unsettled expression of someone who has taken something and is waiting to be asked about it. She was comfortable, genuinely, thoroughly comfortable, which meant the theory was too simple. It was not that she had wanted my life and had taken the opportunity. It was something more fundamental than that. She had decided, at some level I had never seen before, that she was entitled to it. That is a different thing entirely. Desire and entitlement look similar from the outside. They lead to the same actions, but they require completely different responses, because the person who acted out of desire will eventually feel the weight of what they did. The person who acted out of entitlement will simply rearrange their understanding to accommodate it. What she had, instead, was a particular quality of ease that I had not noticed before the posting and could not stop noticing now. She was comfortable. She was at home in my company in a way that was slightly different from how she had been before. Not the warmth of a good friendship, but the comfort of a person who had decided something and had no ongoing conflict about the decision. She had wanted my life. She had taken a significant portion of it, and she had made her peace with that. I want to tell you what I chose not to do with what I had built, because I think the choices you do not make are as much a part of who you are as the choices you do. I chose not to tell people. Not publicly, not broadly, not in the way that would have been easy and satisfying and immediately damaging to Sarah's reputation in the social world we had shared. I had the statements. I had the documentation. I had the capacity to make the story of what she had done available to everyone who had been present during it, who had seen things they had not fully understood, who might have felt, in retrospect, that they had been misled. I chose not to do that, not because she did not deserve the consequences, but because I had not spent 4 months building something careful and complete in order to use it as a weapon aimed at an audience. I had built it to use in the room where it was needed, with the person who needed to see it, in a conversation that ended exactly the way I needed it to end. The people in our social world who had been present during those 11 months made their own recalibrations in their own time, drawing on their own observations. Some of them reached out to me. Some of them did not. I did not need their verdicts to confirm what I already knew. What I needed was for Sarah to sit at my kitchen table and read a folder and understand, without any possibility of reframing, that I had seen everything, that I had always been going to come back, that the life she had been so carefully occupying had never, not for a single day, stopped being mine. That is what I needed. That is what I got. She had wanted my life. She had taken a significant portion of it, and she had made her peace with that, until Sunday afternoon. That observation changed how I understood what I was dealing with. This was not a person who had made a mistake in a moment of weakness and was carrying the weight of it. This was a person who had made a choice over many months and had simply decided the choice was justified, possibly even deserved. Understanding that changed what I needed to build. I was not going to be able to appeal to her conscience. I was going to have to build something that did not require her to feel any particular way about what she had done. Over those 4 months, I compiled everything. My own documentation of the changes to the house, photographs taken room by room on the night I came home, before I had touched anything, time-stamped evidence of what I found, bank records showing continued payments for my lease during the period of unauthorized occupation, the car's service history, which showed the mileage discrepancy, a record of every social event Sarah had attended in my absence, drawn from the group chat history Priya had saved, annotated with the names of the people who had been present and could, if asked, describe what they had witnessed. The statements of 3 people in our social group who, when I approached them individually and explained what I was doing, confirmed what they had seen and agreed to provide written accounts. Not everyone. Some people were unwilling, whether from loyalty to Sarah or from the ordinary human desire not to be involved in something difficult. But 3 people who had been present, who had noticed things, who had not known quite what to do with what they had noticed. Let me be specific about what the file contained by the end of those 4 months, because I think specificity matters. It contained a dated photographic record of the house as I found it on the night of my return, room by room, including the bedroom, the study-turned-dressing room, and the kitchen with its reorganized drawers. It contained the car's service records and a comparison of the mileage against the documented trips I had taken before my posting. It contained my lease, confirming sole occupancy rights, and a letter from my landlord confirming that no authorization for additional occupants had been granted. It contained Priya's notes, precise, dated, each entry written with the careful language of someone who had understood they might eventually be read by a solicitor. It contained the 3 witness statements, each independently produced, each describing specific observations. It contained a complete record of my communications with Daniel during the 11 months, the calls, the messages, the expressions of missing me and looking forward to my return, set against the timeline of what he had been doing while we spoke. I had not needed to fabricate or exaggerate. I had simply placed what was real against what was real. The contrast spoke for itself, and it contained a document my solicitor had helped me prepare, a clear factual summary of the situation, its duration, its components, and its legal implications. Written without heat, without editorializing, just facts ordered in sequence. That told a story complete enough that a stranger reading it for the first time would understand within 10 minutes exactly what had happened. I am a person who works with documents. I have spent my career in environments where the quality of a document determines the outcome of things that matter. This document was the best I had ever prepared. I also, with the help of the solicitor, had Daniel, not as a willing participant. Daniel had, by the end of the 4 months, understood that what he had done was not going to be resolved quietly, and he had retreated into a defensive position that involved a great deal of language about complexity and circumstance. But the record of his conduct, the phone calls during which he had maintained the fiction of a long-distance relationship while actively participating in its replacement, was documented in my phone records, in the messages I had saved, and in the timeline I had built. He was not my primary concern, but he was part of the picture, and the picture needed to be complete. Before I tell you what happened on that Sunday, I need to tell you about the second thing I discovered, the thing that came after the folder was complete, the piece I had not planned for, because I told you at the beginning that this was a story about what I built in the 4 months after I came home, and it was. But it was also, it turned out, a story about what someone else had been building in the 11 months before I came home. I told you about Priya's notes. What I did not tell you yet is what she had put at the back of the folder, behind everything else. She had put a copy of a message she had sent to Sarah in the 7th month of my absence, when it had become clear that the situation was not temporary and was not going to resolve itself. The message said, in careful and precise language, that what Sarah was doing was not invisible, that there were people who were watching, and that Sarah should understand she was not operating without witnesses. Sarah had replied, one line. She had said, "I know what I am doing." Priya had kept that reply for 4 months. She had placed it at the back of the folder, behind the notes and the screenshots and the statements, because she had understood that it was the most important piece of all, not because it proved anything that the rest of the folder did not already prove, but because it showed something that the rest of the folder could not show. That Sarah had known she was being watched and had continued anyway, that she had not been careless, that she had been certain. When I read that reply for the first time, I sat very still for a long time. And then I understood something that changed the shape of the entire 4 months. I had been building something to show Sarah what I knew, but Sarah had known from at least the 7th month that someone was watching. She had continued because she had calculated that whatever was being watched could not be used against her. She had not calculated on the folder. She had not calculated on me. I want to tell you about the evening I finished the file. It was a Saturday, late in October. I was sitting at my desk in the study, restored to its original purpose, the dressing room furniture removed, my books back on the shelves, and I had the full documentation in front of me. Priya's folder, my photographs, the solicitor's summary, the statements, the timeline. I sat with all of it for a long time, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not triumph, not even relief. Something quieter and I think more honest than either of those. I felt sad. I felt sad for the 19-year-old in the cafe who had found what she thought was the friendship that was going to matter. I felt sad for the version of Sarah I had believed in for 18 years, the one who had driven 4 hours to collect me after a bad ending, the one who had known every version of my life and had seemed, for most of it, to be genuinely glad that I was in it. People who hear this story sometimes say, "But were you not furious?" And the honest answer is yes. There were moments during those 4 months of building the file when I was furious in a way that was almost physical, a tight, specific anger that lived in my chest and was connected to the very particular image of Sarah standing in my bedroom arranging my shelves. There were moments when I wanted to call her and say all the true things I was holding, not carefully, not strategically, just loudly and directly, and without any thought for what happened afterward. I did not do that, not because I was not feeling it, but because I had understood from early on that anger used prematurely is anger wasted, that the most satisfying version of the truth being told is the one where the person hearing it has nowhere left to go. But when the file was finished, and the folder was closed and the work was done, what I actually felt was not anger. What I felt was sad. Not for myself, or not primarily for myself, for the friendship, for the real parts of it. For the 20-year-old in the cafe, and the woman who had driven 4 hours, and the person who had known every version of me and had, for most of those years, genuinely cared. I think that is the hardest thing about a long betrayal. It does not erase what came before it. The history is still real. The warmth was still real. The friendship existed and mattered and had genuine substance before it became what it became. And you cannot fully grieve the ending without also reckoning with the truth of what you are grieving. I was grieving 18 years, not the last 11 months. 18 years that had been real and had now been permanently altered by what the final chapter had revealed. I do not know when that version of Sarah ended and the other one began. I am not sure there was a clear line. People are not usually one thing or the other. They are usually both, in different proportions, and sometimes what shifts is not the person but the circumstances that reveal which proportion was always dominant. What I know is this. Somewhere along the way, Sarah had looked at my life and had decided she wanted it. And she had been patient enough and practiced enough and close enough to me to know exactly how to begin taking it. I thought about that for a long time. And then I closed the file and I picked up my phone and I called her. I said, "Can you come to the house on Sunday?" I said I needed to talk about something and I wanted to do it in person. She said, "Of course, is everything all right?" I said, "Everything is fine. I just have some things I want to go through with you. I want to tell you about the morning of that Sunday." I woke up early. The house was quiet in the way it is quiet in autumn, a particular stillness that has weight to it. I made coffee and I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had once thanked Sarah for taking care of things, and I looked at the folder in front of me. I had prepared for this conversation the way I had once prepared for presentations in difficult environments. Not by scripting what I would say, but by being absolutely clear about what outcome I needed and what I was not willing to accept. I knew what I wanted. I knew what I would do if I did not get it. I had no need for drama, no need for lengthy explanation, no need for anything other than the facts on the table and the clarity of what they represented. I thought about the orchid. The pink one was long gone. I had removed it the day I came home and replaced it with a new white one, fragile and slightly unhappy, the way orchids tend to be when they are not quite in the right light. My orchid, the kind I prefer. I thought about what it meant that her first instinct, when she was given a key and an absence, had been to replace the orchid. Not a dramatic act, not a hostile one, just a small, confident substitution of her preference for mine. A preview, in miniature, of everything that followed. I thought, you could not even leave the orchid. And then I heard her knock at the door. She came on Sunday afternoon. She was relaxed when she arrived. She had brought wine the way she always did, and she set it on the kitchen counter and started to open it, and I said, "Let us sit first." She looked at me then, not with alarm, not quite. But something changed slightly in her expression. A small recalibration. We sat at the kitchen table. I put the folder on the table between us. I did not explain it. I said only, "I want you to look at this." She looked at the folder for a moment without touching it. Then she opened it. I watched her read. I have described, in other parts of this story, what it looks like when a person reads something that closes a room they thought was still open. I have described it in the context of a husband, a business partner, an uncle. Each time it looks slightly different because each person's particular version of composure is different. Sarah's was very still. I had prepared for many possible versions of this moment. I had prepared for denial, for Sarah to close the folder and say that I was misinterpreting things, that the documentation was misleading, that what had happened was more complicated than it appeared. She was capable of this. She was good at it. I had prepared for tears, for the version where she dissolved into emotion, and the conversation became about her distress rather than about the documented facts in front of her. Emotion is one of the tools available to people who are running out of other options. I had prepared for aggression, for her to push back, to challenge my account, to find some angle of offense that might shift the moral weight. What I had not prepared for fully was the silence. She read the folder for nearly 15 minutes. She read it the way a lawyer reads a contract. Not quickly, not emotionally, but with the careful attention of someone assessing where the vulnerabilities are. Turning pages back, returning to specific sections, reading the solicitor's summary twice. I watched her read and I understood something that I had not quite understood before. She had known this was possible. Not probable, perhaps, but possible. She had understood, at some level, that if I came back and looked carefully, there were things to be found. She had not been careless because she was confident. She had been confident because she had made a calculation about the likelihood of this moment, and the calculation had been wrong. The calculation had not accounted for Priya. The calculation had not accounted for me. She read without expression for several minutes. She turned pages carefully, with a deliberateness that I recognized as a person buying time by performing thoroughness. When she finished, she closed the folder. She did not look up immediately. When she did look up, she said, "How long have you had this?" I said, "Long enough." She said, "Are you going to the police?" I said, "I have already spoken to a solicitor. What happens next depends on how this conversation goes." She said, "I can explain some of this." I said, "I know you can. You have always been able to explain things. That is one of the things I always admired about you." She said nothing. I said, "What I want you to understand is that I am not here to argue with your explanations. I have the documentation. You have read it. What I want is for us to understand each other clearly," she said. "What do you want?" I said, "I want the house to be exactly what the lease says it is, mine and only mine. I want the car returned in the condition I left it, with any costs associated with the excess use covered. I want a formal, written acknowledgement of what you did, prepared with both our solicitors present, that confirms the facts of the situation. And I want you to understand that I have copies of everything in this folder, and that if any part of what I just described is not honored, I will pursue every legal avenue available to me." She looked at me for a long time. I looked back. She said very quietly, "I thought you would not come back. I thought when you came back, things would be different. That you would see how things had settled and you would adjust." I said, "I know. That is the part I find most interesting. You thought I would come back and adjust to what you had made." She said nothing. I said, "You were wrong about that. You were wrong about me for a very long time." She left an hour later. The formal acknowledgement was signed 6 weeks after that meeting, with both solicitors present. The house was returned to exactly what it had been before. Not by Sarah, who removed herself from every part of my life without further contact, but in the legal and documented sense that mattered. The car costs were covered. The acknowledgement exists and is signed. Daniel and I ended. That conversation was shorter and less interesting than this one, and I will not spend much time on it. He had made his choices, and he had to stand in them, and the standing in them was, from what I understand, uncomfortable. I do not feel much about Daniel anymore. He was a chapter that closed. Sarah left my life the way she had entered it 11 months earlier, without making a scene. The formal process was handled by solicitors and concluded without drama. She did not contact me after that Sunday. I did not contact her. Whatever. She understood about what had happened and what it meant for how she thought about herself and her choices. She kept to herself. I have been asked since then whether I feel anything about her, whether I miss her. The honest answer is, sometimes. Not often. But sometimes, in the specific way that you can miss someone who does not exist anymore. Not the person you knew at the end, but the person you knew for 18 years before it. The one who had driven 4 hours. The one who had sat in the cafe. That person is gone. She was replaced gradually and then completely by someone I did not know as well as I thought I did. And I have learned to hold those two things without needing to resolve them into a single feeling. I grieve what was real. I do not miss what it became. Priya and I are still close. Closer, perhaps, than we were before. Because what she did in those 11 months of waiting and documenting and preparing a folder for someone she trusted would eventually need it was the truest form of friendship I have ever experienced. Not the warmth of presence, but the loyalty of witness. The willingness to see something clearly when it would have been much easier not to, and to hold what she saw carefully until it could be used. I think about what it means to be known. For 18 years I had believed that Sarah knew me. She did, in a way. She knew the shape of my life, the texture of my habits, the people I cared about, the places that mattered to me. She knew all of the external things that make up a life when you have watched it closely for long enough. What she had not understood, what, I think, she had fundamentally miscalculated, was the difference between knowing someone's life and knowing someone. She could copy the orchid. She could change the sheets. She could occupy the space, drive the car, attend the dinners, position herself in the photographs. She could do all of the surface things that, from the outside, constitute a life. What she could not copy was the person who had built it. She could not copy the 11 months I had spent in a difficult posting, doing difficult work, in difficult conditions, that had made me more certain of who I was rather than less. She could not copy the 4 months I had spent coming home to my occupied house every day, and saying nothing, and building something careful and complete. She could not copy what I had learned in the 19-year-old cafe or in the 18 years after it. The actual substance of a person that is not visible from the outside and cannot be installed by rearranging the furniture. She had taken my orchid and my sheets and my car and my boyfriend, and she had come very close to my social world and my home. She had not come close to me. That is the thing about trying to take someone's life. You can take the pieces. You can arrange them carefully. You can make it look, from a certain angle, like what you were aiming for. But the life is not in the pieces. The life is in the person who chose them. And that is the one thing that cannot be taken. Only abandoned. Here is what I want you to take from this. There are people in the world who look at what you have built. Not the big visible things, but the quiet particular things, the details of your specific life. And they decide they want it. They want the shape of your days, the warmth of your relationships, the particular combination of circumstances that you assembled over time by being exactly who you are and making exactly the choices you made. They are not taking your life. They are taking a set of props and trying to perform it. And the performance can be convincing for a while to people who only see the surface, but it will never be yours because you are not in the props. You are in the person who chose them, arranged them, lived with them, built something around them that has your specific weight and your specific history and your specific understanding of what each piece means. Nobody can take that. They can only make you forget it if you let them. Do not let them. If this story stayed with you, if you have ever had to reclaim something that was taken while you were not watching, or if you are in the middle of something that makes this feel familiar, subscribe to this channel. Every week, one story about the person who was supposed to lose and what happened instead. You are not alone in this, and you are not finished yet. We will see you next time.